Hi there, everyone. I want to talk to you today about a great book that I finished reading by S.D. Tucker. It's called Nazi UFOs, The Legends and Myths of Hitler's Flying Saucers in World War II. Now, I've actually already done a review of another book by Tucker called The Saucer and the Swastika. And both books actually cover a lot of the same ground. But the previous book was more about the sort of the narratives and stories that neo-Nazis have used related to aliens and UFOs. This book, on the other hand, is more about the specific flying saucer myths that have been floating around since World War II, or since the end of World War II, I should say. More specifically, since Kenneth Arnold's 1947 sighting, because as the author mentions, there's no such thing as a Nazi flying saucer from the actual period of World War II. So the myth of Nazi flying saucers is something that grew up after Arnold's sighting, which was itself a misreported sighting because he said that he saw 9 craft, silvery objects, which were moving as though they were skipping across water, as though they were saucers. And then the media misquoted him, and it became flying saucers, as though the shape was, a saucer. So anyway, overlaid over those plain vanilla saucers, you got the Nazi saucer myth, and a whole menagerie of Nazi flying saucers has been developed for decades now by various people. You might have heard of things like the Glocke or the Die Glocke, the bell. And there's also the Hanabu saucer. There's a various sort of scout craft, Adamski-style saucers. And there's also the V7 and a giant mothership-type saucer, or spaceship, I should say, like a cigar-shaped thing. And some others as well. I forget what they were all called, but anyway, none of them actually existed. They've been promoted by people who, some of them were engineers who actually did work, for the Third Reich during the war. And you might have heard of somebody called Schriever. He was associated with stories about the Skoda works in Czechoslovakia, which actually had one of the world's best armaments industries, and that was taken over by the Nazis. But some myths are related to that, the Skoda works. And also the BMW works, Munich, I guess. Something to do with BMW. But different personalities have kind of developed this myth. Some of those people were engineers, as I mentioned. Others were fictional authors. Wilhelm Landig as well. He was actually an SS member during the war. And I think he was an Austrian guy. He actually wrote some novels about flying saucers and Nazis and Antarctica, which was a major sort of site for these stories. Other people involved, Beluzzo, who was an Italian engineer. His name was repeatedly misspoken or misspelled, and you can tell that people were plagiarizing each other's stories because Beluzzo's name was spelled Belonzo a lot of the time, so you could tell that people were just copying each other. And neo-Nazis have also taken on board the flying saucer mythos, including Ernst Zundel, the famous, I think, Canadian Holocaust denier. He wrote a couple of books actually about UFOs. He admitted to a journalist that he didn't believe any of that stuff, but he was basically using flying saucers as a way to attract people to Nazism. Because the idea really is, if you think about it, if everything we've been told by the mainstream media and the establishment is a lie, and if UFOs are real, then maybe the Holocaust didn't actually happen, and maybe the Nazis were actually the good guys. That's the sort of point of using flying saucers. There's also kind of a revanchist tendency. So people who want Nazism to return, or the Third Reich to be reestablished. And some people were just butthurt that the Nazis lost because they thought, how can the Aryan Supermen lose the war against the Untermenschen, right? So, surely if the Nazis had just a few more months using their wonder weapons or their Wunderwaffe, they would have won the war. For sure, Germany did have many advanced projects, such as the V rockets, so the V1 and V2. Those were actually used against England. There was also the Messerschmitt Me-262 fighter jet. I think that was the first operational fighter jet in the war, and there's a tie-in with that and the Foo-Fighters. The Foo-Fighters were these lights that were spotted by and reported by Allied and also Axis pilots during the war in the European theater and also in the Pacific theater. Possibly many of those sightings were plasma or ball lightning type phenomena, so atmospheric phenomena, but some of them might have been Messerschmitts viewed from behind, so that would have appeared pretty unusual for the time because nearly all the planes that were used were propeller driven. So imagine you see a jet, especially when it's dark, that would look pretty amazing. But as the author notes, there were not enough Me-262s to account for all the sightings, so that would have just been a small proportion. There was also something called the Feuerball idea, which was that, Feuerball just means fireball in German. That's linked to ball lightning, but it was linked to the idea that maybe the Germans were developing like a secret weapon, that the Foo Fighters were actually German secret weapons. Not flying saucers, however. Sometimes they were reported as ball-shaped, but they were virtually never reported as flying saucers. That's something that came up after Kenneth Arnold's sighting. So that's important to remember. The Kugelblitz, I forget what the Kugelblitz means, but just ideas about how the Germans might have been producing the Foo Fighters and that they might have been weapons or surveillance platforms. There were no confirmed cases where Foo Fighters were actually involved in the deaths of airmen. Also, there's a logistical reason to doubt that the Nazis ever built something like a flying saucer because, when you've got an advanced project, that tends to leave behind a lot of paperwork. Like the Me-262 left behind a lot of documentation, photographs, memos, and so on. And that, it's a really rich historical legacy. So even apart from the actual jets that some people still fly today, like the enthusiasts, we have all the other evidence for the existence of those aircraft. No such thing exists for the flying saucers. So that's pretty... it stretches credulity to think that you could have had such an advanced project, which would have sucked up a lot of resources and people, right? Without the paperwork and other evidence left behind. Now, there was, I guess the closest you could say that there was to a true German flying saucer was, I think it's called the Coander. No, I just have to look that up again, but it was basically like a disc. It was maybe a few feet in diameter, and it was reputed to use some sort of suction or vortex mechanism, and it reportedly spun out of control in the workshop and it flew up into the ceiling. I think it did it twice. I don't know if those reports were ever proven, but the person who was working on that was an engineer, and the thing is that the disc-shaped apparatus was not itself meant to be the flying saucer that would have been, housing any pilots or anything like that. It would have been the engine. So there's no reason to think that the aircraft itself would have been shaped like a flying saucer. You might know about the Avro car. This was Avro was a Canadian company which had contracts with the US Air Force. They were developing something called the Avro car, I guess in the 50s or 60s. Nothing really came from that. It was just a kind of unstable thing. Pilots would fly just like a few feet off the ground, and it used turbine engines, so nothing very advanced, groundbreaking, certainly not anti-gravity or anything of that sort. But the Avro car also fed into saucer myths, and some engineer, was trying to draw links to that and to use that to prove that the Nazis were continuing their research in America, as part of Operation Paperclip. Let me just flip through it a bit just to remind myself of some things that I read. So yeah, it talks about the Foo-Fighters, the metal, let's see, the way that the saucer myth spread through the newspapers, and the exploitation by the far right actually started pretty early. Some of the engineers that I mentioned were trying to kind of sell themselves, at least get their freedom after the war, because some of them had actually been imprisoned for working for the Nazis, and they wanted to basically say that, oh look, I can build you a flying saucer if you set me free. There was a guy in Brazil, actually, a German engineer who had worked for the Nazis, and he'd been jailed, and he was trying to basically tell the Brazilian government that he could build them a flying saucer if they let him go, and also gave him tons of money, not surprisingly. Another guy called Vikto Schauberger, he was another person involved in all these yarns. Fleisnner, he was in charge of like the suction effect, some of the suction effect ideas, and Vikto Schauberger, emissionless engines. There was also this idea about implosion energy, that you could basically drive material into a vortex and then implode it to get energy from it rather than explode it. There was a kind of environmentalist aspect to this as well. Many Nazis were quite fanatical environmentalists, and they saw fossil fuels as basically a Jewish and corrupt technology. So they wanted to transcend that. There was also an electricity aspect, which is really interesting. So Heinrich Himmler, who was the head of the SS, he was obsessed with finding Thor's hammer. He thought that it was recording an actual event in mythology, but that Thor existed in some sense, and that his hammer used some sort of super technology. He instructed the Ahnenerbe division of the SS. This was like the pseudoscientific anthropological division of the SS. He told them to find all the references they could to Thor's hammer in order to reverse engineer it. The hope was that Germany would be able to use electricity to shoot all the Allied planes out of the sky. Of course, that never happened. Many engineers in Nazi Germany saw that this was just pseudoscience, and they rejected some of these weird ideas that were floating around Germany. But some of them believed in this stuff, at least to an extent. Hitler himself kind of believed some of it, but that's been exaggerated to a great degree. Himmler probably believed a little bit more than Hitler. So Himmler was probably a bit more esoterically inclined than Hitler was. But, this has been blown out of proportion. Certainly, however, there was a lot of pseudoscience and kind of mysticism in the lead up to the Nazis, and some of that spilled over. There's tons of stuff in this book. There's a nice chapter there about the toy models that various companies have made of the flying saucers. and including the Revell company in Germany, which actually got into a bit of hot water because they were selling a toy model kit, right, for a Nazi flying saucer. But in Germany, there's a great sensitivity about the Nazis, and anything that seems to trivialize the Nazis or lend any credence to Holocaust denial is severely frowned upon, to put it mildly. And so the Revell company actually retracted that design from the market. They stopped selling it, and they actually issued something of an apology as well. Because they were, when they were selling it, it sort of implied that it was a real thing. There's also another company in China or in Hong Kong which sells a Nazi flying saucer model, and a few other companies. And one of these models actually ended up in the Roswell Museum, where they've got like exhibits on the supposed alien spaceship crash. But there's like a little exhibit about Nazi flying saucers, and they use the Revell kit for that. Again, it implies that it was a real event, but nothing like that ever happened. Very, very interesting chapter. My favorite chapter actually was chapter 8. Chapter 8, sorry. It's called In My End Is My Beginning, the back engineering of Nazi narrative Lego sets. In that chapter, it talks about this really interesting idea by this Argentinian author. Let me just try to find that. 1 second, please. So he was a fictional author. He wrote a book in the early 20th century. Let's see. It was a fictional work, but it was describing like this, here it is, Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges, who died in 1986. His 1940 short story, Talon Ukbar Orbis Tertius, about a secret society. And they basically, in this book, it talks about this parallel universe, really, where everything is subjective and there's no objective reality. And people just kind of believe in these things called Ronia. I'm probably mispronouncing that. It's got an umlaut in it, but it's Hron. The Ronia are these kind of concepts that people believe, and they're real just by virtue of people believing them. So you can invent things, and if people believe them, then it's real, right? And the UFO mythos is sort of like that, and so is the Nazi UFO mythos. So people invent these Ronia, so to speak. People believe them, and they create this kind of reality that they inhabit. And that's very dangerous, actually, because people can also get the idea that you could erase history if people forget about history, because if nobody's there to remember what happened in the Holocaust, and if people are just told that it's a myth, then one day we might not remember anything about it, and then doesn't that mean that it never happened? So that's sort of the goal among some of these neo-Nazis. Anyway, that's a really good chapter. I like the mythological aspects there, and how like fake news comes into play. And how people try to kind of recreate reality with ideas, or even to say that there is no objective reality. And then there's a chapter where the conclusion is about, or talks about the Glocke, the bell. This is a kind of acorn-shaped craft which is entered into the mythos, and it's tied to the Kecksburg UFO case from 1965. That was actually just a meteorite, but people misreported it because it's really difficult to, give an accurate estimate of distance in those cases. So some people thought that it landed only a few hundred meters from them, and some people reported seeing policemen and military cordoning off the area, and that there was like an acorn-shaped craft with kind of runes on the side. Some neo-Nazis have interpreted that to be a Nazi saucer, or not a saucer, but a craft, which was built by the SS, and it was actually a time-traveling machine, according to them. And it traveled forward in time from World War II to 1965, and it crashed. And that the runes were actually, well, the hieroglyphics, the people from, for the Kecksburg UFO case, they were describing hieroglyphics, but the neo-Nazis would say that those were actually Germanic runes. So you see the connection there. Anyway, but the Glocke is complete fiction. There's no such craft. But yeah, it's really interesting how some of these core people in these stories, like Mita, Shriva, and others, they kind of copied each other's ideas or stories, and then they added to them. But you can very clearly track what's going on with the stories. They don't have any basis in reality, except to the extent that you could say, yes, Germany had wonder weapons, which we know about now, but they were not flying saucers. But, it's enough to say that they had wonder weapons for some people to just take that completely in a new direction and say they also had flying saucers. Yeah, so the people, Mita, Schauberger, Fleisnner, Beluso, and various others, they sort of form the core of the Nazi UFO myth. And also Wilhelm Landig, the former SS, the Austrian guy from the SS, with his fictional stories. Of course, also the Holocaust deniers who would also use UFOs, they would amplify these stories even further. All sorts of media have been created about them, including pamphlets and books, videos, and models as well, toy kits. So it's taken on a sort of reality of its own in many people's minds. It's certainly a very evocative image, and it's got some veneer of plausibility, because the Nazis did have a lot of advanced projects going on. And of course, some people are just still angry that the Nazis didn't win because of their own racist reasons. They're angry. So all of that kind of ties together. But the book is really, really good. I really recommend it. I'm probably missing a lot of stuff here. I'm just giving you a very broad brush picture. Let me just mention maybe Roswell as well. Yeah, now that I think about it, Roswell. So Roswell, of course, is the famous supposed crash of the alien craft. Some neo-Nazis have interpreted it to actually be the crash of a German flying saucer. And that the government was basically using the alien story to cover up the reality of Germans doing it, or Germans building the flying saucer, because they don't want the world to know of the splendor of the Aryan race, or something like that. Yeah. But you do get like the use of certain UFO myths which are already out there, and then they get overlaid with Nazism to sort of make them useful for Nazism. Anyway, that's my review. I really recommend the book. You should also read his previous book, The Saucer and the Swastika. And I'll put the link to that one in the description below. Anyway, I'll talk to you soon. Thank you.